So for the first of this series of evenings that Ben referred to earlier on, we thought it would be a good idea to have a kind of overview, really, and give us a chance to think about what is this net zero thing all about? Why is it important to us as Christians, and why is it important indeed in the wider sphere? So why do we need to achieve net zero by 2030? And I'll come back to the bit by 2030 bit later on. But what is this net zero, and why is it relevant? Why should Christians care effectively? So for the first part of my talk, I'm going to be looking at the science effectively. At, I have to say, probably a fairly basic sort of level. We'll think about what is climate change, what do we mean when we say net zero, and then we'll have a little break to talk about that and the chance to have a bit of breakout discussions. And then I'll look a little bit at the specifically theological sort of Christian implications of net zero, because we remember, of course, that net zero is and climate change is absolutely key for the whole of the world. It's not just for us as Christians. Some of you will probably have seen this, the first few slides, certainly, of this presentation already. I purloined them from a presentation I also did to a Creation Care Network group last May sometime, I think. So if you think you've already seen it, you have. I don't think, I make no apology really for doing that, because a recap is useful, and it will be particularly useful when we come to the breakout groups and the question that we're going to ask you to think about in the breakout groups, which I don't think we did do last time. Because we, all of us, if we're going to be advocates for addressing the climate change issue and for addressing the call to get to net zero by 2030, we, all of us, need to know a little bit about why we're having to do it and what some of this stuff means. Not least because there's quite often quite a lot of confusion out there in the wider world and in our churches about what all this stuff means. So what you've got there on the slide, climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. I'm sure you're all aware of the difference between climate and weather. Weather is what we've actually already discussed a little bit this evening. You know, we haven't had much rain in the last few days, or in this month. We've had a lot of wonderful sun, so we've had less cloud. That's weather. Climate is the whole lot put together over a whole long-term way of thinking. So, you know, our climate traditionally in this part of the world is sort of cool, temperate climate, which describes the sort of weather that we have, yes, but individual bumps of weather are not the same as complete change of climate. Climate change is the long-term effects of shifts in temperatures and weather patterns, as it says there. So it's a long-term thing. Climate change is being caused by largely, substantially, nearly all of it, by the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels generate greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gases are mostly carbon dioxide, which comes from the burning of fossil fuels, both in terms of burning petrol and diesel in cars and lorries and such like for transport, but also, of course, the burning of oil and gas in particular for power in power stations to make electricity. Most of those fossil fuels are most of those greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, but there are also two other particular greenhouse gases that are important. One is methane, which is the one that is of concern around farming, because farming methods tend to produce quite a lot of methane. It's not a huge amount by comparison to the amount of carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere, but methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It doesn't last very long in the atmosphere, but it does put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. And nitrous oxide, N2O, again, it's a product of farming. There isn't a lot of it in terms of absolute quantity, but it has a very substantial effect. All of those are greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gases act like a blanket wrapped around the earth, trapping the sun's heat and raising temperatures. In other words, the rays of the sun can get in through the sort of supercharged carbon dioxide rich atmosphere, but they can't then escape quite so easily, and the sun's rays are therefore trapped in that blanket around the earth, the atmosphere around the earth. Oh, sorry. There we go. So greenhouse gases, emission of greenhouse gases causes raising of temperature, of global temperatures. This is quite a dramatic illustration, I think, of what has been happening. You'll see that along the bottom axis, we start at 1880, end of the 19th century, and it goes up to 2020. All right, we haven't quite got to there, but it near enough to the present day. The zero in the middle, if you look down the left-hand axis, that what they've done is to say, what was the average temperature between, well, basically for the whole of the 20th century, between the years 1901 and 2000, and how much did the various years that we've got illustrated there, and if you can probably see my cursor. So the first half up to about 1940, the temperatures of all those various years were basically below the average for the whole of, more or less the whole of the period you're looking at on this chart. There was a little bit of a blip kind of 1940 to 1950. So that's sort of up and down. And in fact, through this area here up to about 1970, 1980, some years were warmer and some years were colder. Since about 1980, the thing has taken off, and we are now a degree, according to this, a degree or so warmer. It's actually about 1.1 degrees warmer than the average for the last 100 years or so. So it's indisputable, really. No serious scientist disputes that the Earth is getting warmer, that the atmosphere of planet Earth is getting warmer. We already have about just over 1 degree centigrade of warming from the kind of 19th, early 20th century average. This is the same, effectively the same graph, but with the proportion, with the percentage of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere imposed upon it. So this grey line here shows us the amount of carbon dioxide, that's what's down the right-hand side here, in ppm is parts per million. When I first knew anything about climate change, 380 parts per million was considered to be, you know, a real warning figure, that this was the figure that we really must try not to go above. It is now at 420. It's gone above 400 parts per million, and it is still rising. And you can see from this the close connection between the rise of carbon dioxide and the rise of temperature, the Earth's temperature. Sometimes you will hear people say, well, yes, I believe that the Earth's temperature is rising, but it's not connected to the amount of carbon dioxide you put into the atmosphere. Yes, it is the science that how the way in which extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is translated into higher atmospheric temperatures, global temperatures, has been well understood since late 19th century. A Swedish scientist called Arrhenius, a Swedish physicist, first identified the fact that there was carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that if you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it would the global temperature could be expected to rise. So we have known about this. We've known about the science of this for well over 100 years, since before the end of the 19th century. And so it's really kind of it's quite clear, and there are no serious scientists now who would dispute that. So yes, it would be, you've made the connection. We make the connection with higher greenhouse gases and rising temperature, and I think we all kind of know that. Results from a wide range of climate model simulations suggest that our planet's average temperature could be between 1.1 and 5.4 degrees C warmer in 2100. So, not that long away now, 80 odd years, than it is today. There's a big range, 1.1 to 5.4. There are a whole range of models, a whole range of scenarios. It's an extremely complicated thing to model. And of course, there are a whole different range of scenarios that they have to model. And the graph on the right-hand side here, if you have a look, this is, well, we're about here now, actually, but the climate models projecting forward from about 2020, there are different scenarios depending on what human beings do to help to mitigate this problem. We'll talk about that in a moment. But if we want to limit our warming to 1.5 degrees C by the end of this century, that's this grey one down at the bottom, the lowest one here. And if you remember that 1.5 was what the world committed itself to at Paris in 2015, they said we don't want it to go higher than 1.5. Then that was what that was the pledge, and this shows under that scenario from 2020 through down to dropping to 1.5 degrees. You've got to reduce the carbon amount of carbon in the atmosphere right down, well, I suppose right down to zero is what it's saying here. I'm not quite sure what these gigatons of carbon dioxide, but per watt, I'm not quite sure. But you've got to reduce it a lot, basically. And as you go up through these different colours, a 2 degrees C warming pathway, you've still got to do a lot of reductions. All countries in the world have made pledges to reduce their carbon emissions. That's what the red thing is that shows here. This is what the red one shows. If all the pledges that have been put into law across the world were enacted and people actually did them, you would still have, according to this, between 2.5 and 3 degrees C of warming. But most countries, although they have pledged to reduce the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, do not actually have policies that will make that happen. So under the current level of policies, we're looking at 3 to going on for 4 degrees centigrade of warming. And this top one here, the grey one, is what happens if you do nothing, and you could go up to nearly 5 degrees. So what we're looking at here is a graph that tells us very clearly that even working on the pledges that we have made, we're still in for quite a lot of warming. And actually, of course, most governments have not actually enacted the policies. They've not put the pledges into policies effectively yet. The other thing about the global climate change is that the emissions and the effect of the emissions is very unevenly distributed. The top map shows you quite clearly that right across the Northern Hemisphere and indeed into Saudi Arabia and also Australia, so the developed countries of the world, or semi-developed countries, looking at Russia perhaps, are areas of very high emissions. So they're the ones that are pumping the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But the countries that are already, well, it says vulnerable to climate change, they're already suffering from climate change, are vast amounts of Africa, and some bits of South America as well. Yes, there are bits obviously around the Pacific Basin and so on. You can see in detail. This is quite an old map, this one, 2011. But it is very much still the case that the countries who have put the least amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere are the ones whose livelihoods are being most impacted. And this is a big issue for Christians, which I'll come back to. You will now begin to hear rather more said about the issue of climate justice. And that this diagram illustrates very much what we mean by climate justice. It means, or climate injustice. There is an injustice that is demonstrated by this slide, by these two maps. The injustice being that the wealthy countries are the ones that are putting all the CO2 into the atmosphere, but it's the much less wealthy countries who are not contributing to they have the smallest carbon footprint themselves, but they're more deeply impacted. And that is, like all justice things, very much an issue for Christians. The effects of climate change are just illustrated in this this diagram here. I think we know quite a lot about those: rising sea levels, heat-related illnesses, droughts, storms, forest fires, and so on. And if you think about that previous slide I just showed you, you can see that, parts of Africa, for example, if you're getting more droughts, that's going to severely impact, in particular, places in Africa. If you're getting worse storms, that will impact, in particular, yes, lots of parts of Africa, but also lots of coastal areas, which you saw in some of that on the last slide. And in fact, that is also the case, particularly in Cornwall, the worst storms happening. That is a climate change effect that's beginning to happen even here in Cornwall, to people who can, like us, who, despite the fact that we might all groan about it, we can afford it to pay for the damage, the repair of the damage, much better than some parts of Central Africa. Oh, I'm talking about Cornwall. This is a slide that I don't think I did include last time. You might like to Google sometime the Cornwall Climate Risk Assessment. Cornwall Council is the first county council to commission a climate risk assessment report. It came out quite recently, end of last year sometime, I think, or sometime last year. The link is in, if you get sent the notes, the PowerPoint presentation, which you're welcome to have, the links to some of these things, and including this one, are in the notes. And basically what they're doing is assessing the risks of what risk does climate change pose to Cornwall, and you can see from that diagram that there are a whole range of things. If you live down west near Penzance, you'll know that the armouring in the front of the to keep the railway line safe as it goes into the railway station at Penzance, huge great granite blocks that they've got to use for that. And that will get more and more impacted. It'll become more and more expensive to maintain that. I don't really need to say anything about storms. We've all had lots of storms. We've sometimes had fires up on the moors and flooding and so on. So there's all these various things. And somebody mentioned earlier the Cornwall Climate Care films, documentary films, and I put the link to that website in the chat. The first one, I think it's, I don't know, the second one perhaps of those, one of those documentaries on there is all about climate change and the risk to Cornwall. Very, very good, well worth watching. So we know what climate change is doing, we know what it can do. So what does this net zero thing mean? Well, we bandy it about, and what do we need? What you've got in the middle of the slide there is a sort of official definition of net zero: achieving a balance between the amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced and the amount removed from the atmosphere. So what that is saying is we need to be making sure that we are removing from the atmosphere as much carbon as we are putting in. So, you know, well, yes, I'll just leave it at that. A balance between the amount we're producing and the amount we're removing. It is not about necessarily about reducing our emissions to zero. That would be absolute zero in terms of emissions. And so we're not talking about reducing our total emissions to absolutely nothing, although we are talking about reducing our emissions dramatically. But we are also talking about needing to put things in place that will remove carbon from the atmosphere. But we do need to notice that getting to net zero effectively stops the emissions where they are now. Levels of CO2 will still be too high because all we're doing is saying, right, we need to just sort of, we're reaching a balance point. If we actually want to reduce the amount of emissions that are going into the atmosphere, we need to be we need to be reducing below the dangerous level, the 400 parts per million that we've got to at the moment. If we need to reduce it back down again, then we need to be actually taking more carbon out of the atmosphere than we're putting in. So we need to go below net zero effectively. So the challenge is indeed a significant one. So removing carbon from the atmosphere, we sometimes talk about carbon sequestration. I don't think I've actually got that word on a slide in this presentation, but carbon sequestration just means it means absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Two ways: increase the Earth's ability to absorb carbon dioxide, so do things with the surface of planet Earth so that it is more able to absorb carbon dioxide naturally, and then also decrease the amount of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere. And we need to do both, and we need to do it as fast as we can. This is quite a nice little diagram here that shows us how the carbon cycle works. What are the things that absorb carbon, really? Vegetation absorbs carbon, and indeed what are the sorts of things that that release carbon. So you're absorbing carbon with vegetation, trees and so on, but you're also producing carbon with fossil fuel use, with agriculture, growing animals, and so on. The marine environment is a very, very important carbon sink. it will absorb carbon, but it hasn't got an infinite capacity, and the carbon, the ocean is already being affected by having too much carbon held in, carbon dioxide held in solution, which changes the acidity. That means that, and it means that it's more difficult, for example, for small little crustaceans to get calcium out of the seawater, so their shells get thinner. You know, there's a whole kind of ecosystem effect on all of this. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. And that was a very quick run through. Just before we go into our breakout rooms, Ben, can I just ask if anybody has got any questions of clarification they want to ask about what I've just gone through? Maggie? You're muted, Maggie.
There we go. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd just like you to clarify, please, about the nitrogen problem. The cow business. You see, you haven't got that in all the stats. It's only carbon dioxide.
Well, what happens is that the main carbon greenhouse gases that are emitted from it's cows and sheep mostly, because they're ruminants.
Yes. Yeah.
And they emit carbon CH4, methane, and that is then it actually transforms to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In the atmosphere, and therefore it makes carbon dioxide. So what they do is what you'll see on the statistics is so many tons of CO2 equivalent.
Right. Okay.
So when it's measured, that includes the methane. It also includes the nitrous oxide. And don't ask me how they do that calculation. I'm not sure. But they convert that to this amount of nitrous oxide is equivalent to this amount of carbon dioxide, and they incorporate it all as if it was carbon dioxide, because that gives us a good measure to compare with.
That's helpful. Now, but you see, you had a very high percentage for cement production there on that last slide. Yep. Now, how does that relate to the amount that the cows are producing? I mean, we're encouraging everybody, obviously we want all these houses built, roads built. We've got, I mean, everything is, sorry, Ben's.
Well, no, you're absolutely right, Maggie. Cement production and what are considered mainstream manufacturing methods or building methods turn out to be some of the most utterly harmful products we can use.
Right.
And yet we are stuck. So having just walked through a year of building and not being allowed to leave my massively overspec'd foundations in from a previous build, even though they were gigantic and huge and actually double the size of the foundations that are now required, I wasn't allowed to leave them there. I had to replace them and dig them all out. But that started our whole journey as to why we ended up using recycled concrete and everything that we possibly could in our build.
Yeah.
But it's a huge question, is how we build and create infrastructure without polluting.
And what I mean, I haven't heard of any research that's being done to to change this.
Masses of research is being done. I went to a presentation last year at a conference by a chap called Julian Allwood, who's the professor of material science at Cambridge University, who is absolutely on fire with leading research into this.
Great.
If I can find it, I think I've got a paper by him, which was very...
You shared it with me.
Did I? Right.
Well, one of us will have it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so it would be quite useful for you all to have. It's one of the really big challenges, Maggie, is how do we make buildings, how do we build enough housing for all the people who need houses, bearing in mind how much carbon it puts into the atmosphere. And it's not totally, it's not been solved yet, certainly. Andrew, did you have a question?
Just pick up on that last thing about all the concrete used for all the wind farms, but that's not where I was heading. Do you have any indication of any figure? Because there must be a time lag between a given level of carbon dioxide and the temperature of the Earth actually rising. After all, the Earth is a massive heat sink, a thermal mass, so it doesn't heat up, or it doesn't respond in temperature as quickly as the CO2 changes.
Well, actually, if you look at that graph, I can't bring it up now quickly, but that graph I showed you with the rising temperature and the rise of CO2, I mean, the rise of CO2 and the rise of temperature, that seemed to me to be pretty much going up in step. Yeah, having said that, you know, Arrhenius at the end of the 19th century said, this is what is going to happen if you go on putting CO2 into the atmosphere. But it didn't really start to be noticeable until about 50 years after Arrhenius was around. And there is no doubt that even if we completely stopped today producing CO2 and putting it into the atmosphere, and we were able to hold the, it was effectively stop at 400 parts per million, the temperature would go on rising until it started to fall. So there would be a delayed reaction. I don't know what I'm not sure if it is known what the delay would be. My guess would be several decades at the very least before you start to determine that the temperature might be at least flattening off. But I'm not aware of having read anything that says anything like that. Your question is, what do you or can you say to someone in your congregation who says to you, I don't believe in climate change, it's all rubbish?
Doreen.
Yes, I think to do nothing is not an option. And if it's only doing away with artificial lawns, digging up bricked over gardens and having actual plants and that there instead would assist.
Yeah, every little
Thank
helps.
you. Another voice? Don't be shy now. George.
Okay, we covered a couple of things. First thing was, have we had anyone in the congregation who's actually ever said that? And none of us had, but we did feel that there are maybe sort of three types of people: one who deny, one who don't do anything about it, and one who actually do something about it. And there was some discussion about whether that one in the middle is almost tantamount to denying it because you don't actually do anything about it. And then the last thing we said was, if they did say that, then perhaps a point to make to them is, are you concerned about, if not yourself, how about your children or grandchildren? Or do you know any young children? Do you know any young people? So that was it, I think.
Thank you. Go on then, Andrew.
Wasn't exactly an answer to the problem, but somebody brought up people who accept that we've got global warming, but don't reckon that it's due to humans. So therefore, we are actually, that's a very good point. We are irresponsible rather than not responsible.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
And on top of that, I'm sorry, well, it's the same group, but we were talking about using the science, using Ellie's slides really, and talking people through the science, if it's just that they don't believe that it's happening, because there's enough science there to prove that it is for most people.
Great. Dorian, I'm just going to see if anybody else from one of the other groups. We must have one more group that hasn't brought something back, but you don't have to. No pressure. Go on then, Dorian.
Our group.
My response to anyone who asks me that they don't believe there's any global warming is to just look out of the window, just observe the news, and I think it's nature is saying for itself that there's something amiss.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And one final point, and I never tire of saying this because I believe it deeply, is that we pray for the change with those with cloth ears and blind eyes. So within our church congregations, when we have people, or in our communities who just go, not having it, prayer changes things. So we pray for people as well in those scenarios. Ellie, over to you.
Okay, I will carry on sharing if I can find the right. So there we go. So you should now be able to see that one. Oh, come on. Right, so the sort of second half of what we were looking at this evening is, why does this matter to Christians? I mean, you might want to look at this and think, well, this is an absolute no-brainer. Of course it matters to Christians. It matters to everybody. It's a matter of justice, which I'll come to. And it matters for the well-being of God's creation. And yes, all of those things. But I just want to spend a short while now kind of looking a little bit more specifically about this, because again, there are those within the church who will say, well, yeah, it might be happening or whatever, but we don't need to worry. It's not specifically something that we need to be bringing into our churches or thinking about in our churches. And again, this is an attitude that you may find some sort of variation on it. That we should be spending more time thinking about how we can stop the rain coming through the roof of the church, or getting the coffee rota sorted out. Both of which are important, but this is important too, if not more important. So obviously the Bible doesn't mention climate change or net zero or greenhouse gases of any of those things. And like many aspects of trying to apply our Christian faith to the life around us, to the life we lead, we have to just stand back a little bit and look at perhaps the overall picture of that the Bible gives us, and just then sort of apply the kind of just use our God-given intelligence to apply that to our present circumstances. And of course, where we started with the reflection that Ben brought to us at the beginning of this session, the beauty of God's creation is a theme throughout the Bible. And of course, we have a responsibility to care for nature. God has put us here in the garden, if you like, to care for others, and that includes both human and non-human others. We have, it goes without saying really, through a whole of Christianity, of course we care for our neighbour, but we have tended to confine that word neighbour to our human neighbours. Today, in today's world, we need to be thinking about our neighbours as our non-human neighbours, the animals, the plants, the birds, and so on as well. In that kind of
what you will do
way of thinking.
It's the one thing you will do in
somebody's not got there. Can you mute yourselves and we'll have a chat afterwards, I think is easiest. Otherwise we might get a bit distracted. There's any amount of Bible quotes that I could throw at you, and I'm not going to do any more than what's on this slide. For those of you that are in churches, go to churches where they use the Revised Common Lectionary, you'll find that this coming Sunday, 2 before Lent, has got a very strong creation theme. All the readings, Old and New Testament, are themed on creation, and that will give you much more to kind of reflect on if you take those. We've got the whole of Genesis chapter 1. So if you're reading on Sunday morning, you might take a deep breath. But, you know, these are some of the classic ones. 2 creation stories, of course, in Genesis. The first one, which we're very familiar one, the second one, which is the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. He put the man there to look after it. And the Psalms, of course, absolutely full of care for creation, and it runs right through the Bible. And then of course you get to again the reading that we've got coming up this Sunday, consider the lilies of the field. It is true that in the New Testament and in the Gospels in particular, I think you have to look a bit harder for the creation care. It's more implicit than explicit. Jesus constantly uses references to the land, the plants, the animals, the farming life that goes on around him in Galilee. He didn't know anything about climate change. There was no climate change. There wasn't the same environmental degradation in those days. But the kind of acceptance of this creation as God's good creation is right there in Jesus's teaching, in the same way as it is in the Old Testament. So it's there throughout. Now, this slide and the next few slides are some ones that I purloined from a Green Christian presentation, which was put together for COP26. So 18 months or so ago now, but there's 4 slides with 4 kind of key thoughts really about care for creation: wonder, justice, joy, and hope. Now, thinking about the wonder, that's what we're thinking of, what this slide encourages us to think about. All of creation is sacred and full of wonder. There are a couple of quotes there. Elizabeth Theocritoff is, I think, an Orthodox theologian. George will probably correct me if I've got that wrong, but I think she's an Orthodox theologian who has written quite a lot on these sorts of things. So as we cease to look at the world through the fog of our own desire to possess, there forms a space of wonder and respect, allowing each creature to exist in itself and for its creator. Bishop James Jones has said, we are part of nature, not apart from it. There is no future for anyone if COP26 is bad for nature. And then, of course, the well-known quote from Romans, the creation waits with eager longing to be set free from its bondage to decay. Another passage that comes up this coming Sunday. The other phrase, another phrase that I talked about earlier, this is an issue of justice. The most vulnerable communities, those least responsible for damage to the climate, they're the ones most likely to suffer devastating loss and damage. This is a big theme for Christian Aid in particular at the moment. And again, you can see those quotes down the right-hand side of that slide that illustrate the need to do something about the climate, because we're in a position to do something about it, and the people who are getting damaged by it are not. That phrase climate justice is increasingly being kind of used within churches, and I would recommend that you use it. You probably have to explain it to people because it's not common parlance yet, but it is increasingly so, and it really ought to become more so. This is another particular something that's particularly been brought to us by Green Christian. They've got a campaign called Joy in Enough, which really means this is about contentment. It's about being happy with the stuff that we have already got with our existing provision, and rather than constantly wanting this growth thing, which is what you hear about all the time from government and other places. A couple of quotes there from the one on the left from Hannah Malcolm. I'll read you the one from Bishop David Atkinson because it's probably a bit small. Our Christian story is not about the acquisitive society, but rather about a cooperative society and the common good, based not on the assumption of individual self-interest, but on living within God-given limits, on shared human values and the welfare of all God's creation. So contentment is about having just enough to live on, not keeping on this growth stuff. And then finally, one of the great words of Christian doctrine really is hope. That as Christians we have hope. It's the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen. And one of the things that is, some of you may be aware, very much beginning, I think, to infest the more secular climate change campaigns is a feeling of despair, a feeling of hopelessness, a feeling that they've been working at this, some of them for decades, and it's really not getting through. And that is a concern I share, but I do think that hope is something that as Christians we really have to cultivate in this context, and something that we can really bring to the table, which is valuable as a specifically Christian perspective. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 areas. I'm going to whip through these reasonably swiftly because we've got questions to do again. How do we put this into practice? And again, Green Christian identified 5 areas in which we need to do stuff. So the UK must manage trees, hedgerows, soil, etc. to sequester carbon, restore wildlife, basically sort out the food system. We can do things individually ourselves, but actually a lot of this is to do with how government organise the sort of tax and the taxation and subsidies and so on regime. There's a lot that government need to do as far as that's concerned, as well as stuff that we should do. Again, more renewable technologies, yes, behavior change. We can all change our behaviors, but again, changing the tax regime, changing planning regimes and so on to emphasize renewable technologies and to de-emphasize fossil fuel technologies. Again, a lot of that is to do with what government needs to do, and our role in that is to press our MPs and so on to address this. The world is nowhere near being on track for decarbonising in time to prevent climate breakdown, quote. Trade and consumption, that's about, again, about challenging this endless growth agenda. A lot we can do as individuals here, to not use resources at an unsustainable rate. And then the future, somebody mentioned young people earlier, I think. Teach the Future, that's noted on the right-hand side of this slide, is an organisation, a student organisation that campaigns for better teaching of sustainability in schools and colleges. And in fact, I'm directly involved in bringing some of that into being at Truro College through my chaplaincy. But again, this is something that government needs to take action on because they need to change the syllabuses really. But sustainable net zero economy, we all have a part to play. And that, you know, that's all part of hope. So yeah, there's a whole mass of stuff there. And then finally, transport. Very sad in Cornwall that the network of cycle trails that was so publicised and was going to go into place as part of the A30 dualling project Strangely, the A30 dualling project is still going, but most of the cycle trails have been pulled. Cornwall Council are getting a bit of flack for that at the moment, rightly so in my view, because they made a complete mess of it. One of them was going to come right past my front door, which is partly why I'm excited about it. But we absolutely need to do something about transporting more cycle paths, better lower emissions public transport, and getting people to use public transport rather than cars. Very quick whiz through why 2030. The church, of course, has committed itself to net zero by 2030. Church of England has. Cornwall Council has also done that. Here's a nice little net zero church with solar panels and electric car charging point and bike racks and lots of good planting going on and saving of water. And I suspect these are little solar lights here. Lots of stuff going on in that church that could make it towards net zero. As many of you will be aware, it's the Communion's 5th mark of mission, which is written on there: strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. So, you know, this is a call of our church to do this, as well as a call from the Bible, from God. And the Pope Francis, of course, I'm sure many of you are aware, you know, he has really championed this cause for the Roman Catholic Church. Many of you will have seen, I'm sure you'll have seen that diagram, that document before, the Church of England route map to net zero carbon by 2030. If you haven't seen it, it's on the Church of England environment page of the Church of England website. And it's very detailed, lots of helpful stuff in there about what you can do as a church. We're going to go into breakout rooms again, probably again only for about 5 minutes if we're going to keep to time. So here's your question, which I remember to put up on here now. What is one thing you can do personally to help address climate change, and one thing that you're going to encourage your church to do? So one thing for you personally, one thing you're going to encourage your church to do. And I will put that in the chat as well.
Thank you, Ellie. So we are slightly fighting time here, as they say, time and tide and all that. I wondered that maybe we don't go to groups, but that we use the chat facility. So, because it's good to actually do something and actually say, I am going to do this, not just verbally, but sometimes to do it with our hands. So I wonder if you feel like it, you can use the chat facility and say, I am going to, or I am going to encourage my church, and as they come up, we'll acknowledge those as they come. So if you want a couple of minutes to think about what is it that you're going to do, or you feel able to do, and what is it you're going to strive to encourage your church community, or indeed wider community, to do. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes. There you go. Feel free to type into the chat. If you want to speak it into the room, you can also do that.
One thing I think we're beginning to get off the ground is actually getting a climate change advocate within the church. Meeting opposition, somebody says, oh, they've got to have a job description and this, that, and the other. But we'll get there. I think on an individual level, we'll do very well, but to consolidate trips out in the car and achieve as much as possible on one outing.
Absolutely, thank you. Maggie, your tree planting is astronomical. Thank you.
Wow, yes, that's amazing.
Thank you, Sheila. Yeah. And you know, certain species of trees, like I love it when that happens. My brain's just dropped the tree I was about to say. So one that the bark peels off in a very beautiful way.
London Plane.
Pardon?
London Plane.
Birch.
Or
Cherry
eucalyptus.
tree.
Eucalyptus.
All right.
Eucalyptus is particularly fast
Yes,
at sequestering CO2. It's one of the best plants.
is it?
Um,
Right.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, good stuff, George, that you get creation care on the PCC agenda. Yeah,
Bless you, thank you, yeah. Car sharing,
yeah.
solar panels. Remember that when we do solar panels, you need to allow in your kind of your thinking that there is a carbon cost to the production of those panels. So you kind of have to think about how long their lifespan and all those sorts of things. One flight a
Excellent,
year.
Helen, that's good.
Yeah.
School Inset Day to talk to teachers about eco-church. Brilliant.
Thank you.
We've removed our wood-burning multi-fuel stove,
Have you?
and we're having electricity, and our supplier is green energy. So
Well done. Yeah,
hopefully that will help a little bit.
yeah. Yes, air miles associated with food. Don't buy lettuces from Spain or tomatoes or cucumbers from
No.
Spain. You can manage without through the winter. We've got lots of carrots and cabbage that we grow in this country that you can make into salads. Absolutely.
I agree.
What I think is very bad is recipes which tell you put this in the oven for 6 hours.
Well, you need to adapt them. If you've got a slow cooker.
I know, but I think the recipe writers should be challenged on that.
Yeah.
Thank
Yes,
you. There's so much good stuff here. Bug hotels, absolutely. If you ever visit Salisbury Cathedral have built a model bug hotel of their cathedral outside the cathedral entrance. So it's absolutely fantastic.
Oh, wow.
So it's just like the cathedral, but for the bugs.
Hey,
You'll probably get baptized.
fabulous.
Which ones live in the spire?
Obviously the holiest one.
Thinnest ones.
Penthouse suite.
Brilliant. Thank you all for participating in that and for sharing so many of your ideas. I have to say, Anne, I'm with you on the one. We try not to fly at all now, but there are occasions where one needs to. But I'm all about exploring our own beautiful land and doing road trips. So
Ben, I've got just one more slide.
ready go.
Advertising stuff. Can I just share that one?
Of course you
It
can.
would take me 2
Yeah.
seconds. It's this one. Come on. Just to share a couple of shameless adverts. We were asked by the DAC to please, in churches and to share with you that they're really quite a friendly bunch and they do know quite a lot of stuff about net zero in churches, and they're always willing to give you advice. So do go to the DAC Net Zero 2030 slot on the Diocesan website, which you've got a screenshot of there. There's some kind of downloads and things you can do there, or you can simply get in touch with them and ask about, questions about solar PV and that kind of stuff. Get them to come out and have a look at your church. And they now have to consider net zero when they consider applications. They can't, they're supposed to make that, it's the rules. So do bear that in mind. And then finally, a shameless plug, although do come along for the Big Green Fair at the Cathedral on Saturday, March the 4th. If you're part of a group and you'd like to have a stall, then do book a stall. You can do that through the Cathedral website. But if you're not booking a stall, do please come and see what there is and find out what else is going on. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. No, that's great. Ellie, thank you so much again for all your time and effort. These things don't just happen. I know that you are probably building this on a Saturday or a Sunday and making it all come together in your not spare time that you seem to have none of. So bless you and thank you for coming out this evening and sharing with us.
It's a pleasure.
Let's just say thanks to Ellie. Thank you so much.
Fine. Thank you very much.
Is the Big Green Fair on the Diocesan website?
I think it is.
It
Yes.
should
It will be in
I
the
have sent
newsletter.
it to them.
Will it be on, or does the cathedral have a separate website?
Oh, yes.
They
oh,
do.
Yes, yes.
So it would definitely be on that.
It's definitely,
Yes.
it's definitely on there, yes, on the front page.
Okay.
And if any of you fancy coming and kind of representing who we are as the Creation Care Network and bringing any examples of what you're doing, get in touch with me. I'm off next week because it's school half term, so I'm not around. But Rosie, are you around?
Yeah, I'm around.
So if we can collate stuff through Rosie and I, we would love to have a great presence there. This is one of our in-person events that we do through the year. So come along, enjoy a day out in Truro, come and have some fellowship at the cathedral. Make sure you wrap up if it's cold. And we really look forward to sharing in that together. So in these closing minutes, just some notices to share with you of things coming up. We've heard about the Big Green Fair. We also will have a number of books from what was our Creation Care library, because the church house, the head office, as it were, for the diocese is moving into part of the cathedral buildings at the cathedral in the next few months. So there will be a number of green books which you are welcome to come and help yourself to be inspired or share them with others. So come and have a look at those. That would be great. We'll have those at the Big Green Fair. There are two significant events coming up. I'm just going to very quickly see if I can share my screen. But I really want to encourage you to have a look at. Somebody shout that you can still hear me, because I can't see any of you now.
We can still hear you.
Bless you. Thank you, Rosie. Is this going to go? Great. Let me just bring up this one and this one and this one. So Show the Love is a campaign by the Climate Coalition that coincides with Valentine's. You may remember last year, people wearing green hearts or sending green hearts to people. Well, we're this year really encouraging people to write to their MPs, tell them why creation matters to you so much, why you want to see the government responding to it as a matter of urgency and priority. So the link there is to the Climate Coalition. You can find details about this here. In a future gathering, we're going to start talking about encouraging one another to step into one of our three priorities, either cherish creation, cut carbon, or speak up. And this very much sits under Speak Up. And I'm delighted to say that Anne and Duncan Petty are willing and able to help stand in that space and kind of be advocates for the speaking up and help start to encourage us and gather us in that direction. So I know they would happily talk to you as well. But Show the Love, that will be on the notice sheet. It doesn't have to land on Valentine's Day. It can land within kind of the sphere of Valentine's Day. So if you fancy doing something relatively simple and quick that comes with weight and makes a difference, can I encourage you to do that? Let me then bring up Net Zero in My Neighborhood. This is a great thing that has come out, which is kind of saying, do you want to be a climate champion in your community? And I've heard through this evening a number of people speaking and saying, I'm engaging with the council. I'm engaging with our local councillors. And that is such a fantastic and powerful thing to do. Christian advocacy within climate care is just essential. We need to have our voices in those spaces, both as voices, I hope, of reason and grace and love, because these spaces are often full of friction, but also just to be there. Even if you're the person who's praying in the room for change, it's a great piece of work to be involved in. So this will again be included in the newsletter that comes out next week. And then finally, just to remind you that the energy footprint tool, the EFT, is open. It opened early this year, and this is now the pattern going forward, that it will open on the 1st of January or thereabouts, and it will close in July. So we have, or is it June, Rosie? Sorry.
It's July.
It is July, isn't it? Thank you.
End of July.
So just want to encourage you that we really need to hit 80+% return rate so that we have data that is usable to help us as a diocese understand how to respond and which churches are our key churches to respond to and work with. That doesn't mean we're going to ignore quiet and small churches. it just means that the quickest win we can have is to work with our biggest emitters. And what I get is when you do your parish returns, I get a great big list of churches that have filled or done or not done certain bits. And on the headlines at the moment, it's nice to see that for parish returns, none submitted. For statistics and mission, none submitted. For energy footprint tool, 12 submitted. So bless you 12 who have already done that. And the rest of you, we'd love to have you doing that and helping us gather that data. I'm going to stop that and come back.
Ben, just to say that treasurers have been notified today again about this, so everybody's treasurer will know.
Fantastic, thank you. So there's a whole raft of things there that will come out to you as part of the newsletter. And I just wanted also to say, coming back to some of the stuff we've been looking at Net Zero, there is the large document of the footprint, the roadmap to Net Zero that the Church of England has produced. We are working on breaking that down and creating bite-sized, approachable elements that every church can respond to. So be big or small, busy or quiet, lots of electricity, no electricity, and I'm always reminded at this point of Advent Church, which is in the middle of a field with no power whatsoever. And, you know, but everyone has a role to play and everyone has a way that they can respond. And we as the church are called to respond to this and help encourage others into community in doing this. I know it's been a really full evening and we've had lots of information coming at you and with each other. So let's just take a moment, let's be still, and then I'll close in prayer. Thank you for your goodness to us, Father, Creator, God. Thank you that you called all of this around us to being, and indeed it is good. And we pray tonight for those who find themselves in places that do not feel or appear or indeed are good, places where they feel vulnerable or threatened or lost or hurting or damaged. And we ask, Lord, that you would be their provider and their healer and their restorer, that you would be their hope. And as we go off into our evenings, we just pray that may your blessing rest upon us, the blessing of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Rest upon us and dwell with us and all those whom we love this evening and forever. Amen.
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 Friends, thank you. It's always a real privilege to spend this time with you. It's always encouraging. I love seeing your smiling faces. And anything that you want to follow up from this, as I said, it's been a full evening, just email, just communicate, and we will respond as swiftly as we can. But thank you for all that each one of you is doing in your setting. You are Creation Care champions. Bless you.